I am very glad to be back here presenting for Ideate Software again, covering Ideate automation today. Hopefully a tool you all can use by the end of this to save you a little time in your day-to-day workflows with Revit. So in today's presentation, I'm going to be primarily speaking from my experience as a professional educator in the AEC education space and as a LinkedIn learning instructor. So if there is any interest in any of the topics I talk about today, definitely check me out on LinkedIn Learning. You can search my name. But with that, let's get started with the presentation. So to get started, I just wanted to lay the foundations and just discuss what is Ideate automation for those that may or may not know. So Ideate automation is a Windows-based application that runs repetitive tasks on your Revit files. So these would be tasks like printing the model, publishing the model, opening your Revit file, right? So these could all be, automated using Ideate automation. And today I specifically wanted to talk about these topics from the perspective of secure server-based projects. And the reason I wanted to do this is because I think there is a lot of opportunity for Ideate automation to fill in some of the gaps that come, or maybe some of the challenges that come with server-based projects. And when I refer to secure server-based projects, I'm referring to non-cloud collaborated projects. So those projects that are not pushed to BIM 360 or ACC. And when you work in those types of limited environments, you can sometimes lose some really key features, and Ideate automation can fill in some of those gaps, in my opinion. I also thought that Ideate automation out of the box offers a lot of great template tasks that helps manage and improve model quality, specifically for a digital twin, but also from the perspective of the Revit model as a final deliverable. It's becoming more and more common for the Revit model to be a part of the final deliverable for the client. And when that is the case, we as BIM managers are really put on the spot to make sure that we are delivering a really great product. And Ideate automation offers some really great model metrics that we can get out of the box or really fully customize to verify that model quality. So Ideate automation does have a few requirements. First off, your computer must be on for Ideate automation to run. So there is a really nice value in that Ideate automation, the separate program, can run on your local computer or a secure server that your company controls. But if you set a task to run at 12 a.m. and your computer's not turned on, it won't run. But I usually recommend setting up these tasks to start at the beginning of your workday or the end of your workday. So big key point there. Next, you also need to have a Microsoft account. So you don't necessarily need the complete Microsoft 360 account, but you do need to be logged into your Microsoft account, and the tasks are going to use some of those features because this is a window-based program. And you will also, in some cases, need to have Ideate Revit plugin tools for certain tasks that we're going to be running. And finally, if you are working with cloud collaborated projects, you will need to be logged into your Autodesk account from the Ideate automation window. And I just wanted to point out that there are a handful of tasks, actually a lot of tasks that have very minimal requirements. Your computer just needs to be on and you just need to be logged into your Microsoft account. So it's a really low barrier to entry for a lot of these automation tasks. So before we get into our tasks of the day, I wanted to talk a little bit about the interface really quickly. This is the standalone interface. We start with the home. This is going to show you some of the tasks that you've already run. It can allow you to create new tasks. It's basically just your dashboard to understand how you've been using the program thus far. The next section is the Create window. This is going to give you a really great list of out-of-the-box template tasks that Ideate automation gives you at the start. So we're going to be spending a lot of our time here today going through some of these automation tasks here and creating them from scratch, or creating them, I should say, from the template. And just a little note here, remember I mentioned earlier that there are certain task requirements, right? And the team at Ideate has done a really nice job of organizing these template tasks where the first set of tasks have that very basic requirement, you just need your computer on, while the second set of tasks organized in this list do require Ideate Revit plugins to run along with a handful of potentially other requirements. But what's nice is as soon as you check on one of those tasks, it's going to show you in the description on the bottom your list of prerequisites and your requirements. So, if you forget anything I say, hopefully it's listed out in front of you as you're interacting with it. Next in the interface, we have our files. So if you were to be working with cloud collaborated projects, this is where you would sign into your account to access those models. However, it should show you by default, regardless of whether you're signed in, your list of most recent projects that you opened in this interface here. If you don't see your list of files in this interface, you can always add those files later by directly navigating to them. Next, we have our task window. This is going to be your dashboard for all of the recent tasks that you've run and their status. This is also a really great place to clone a task or copy and paste it and apply it to a different project if it's working really well. And we also have our settings window, and we're going to be coming back to this in a future part of this presentation, but this is where essentially you put up all of your settings, right? And we're specifically going to be focusing on some of the features available when you interact with the library paths here. And the library paths are basically that directory of where all of your template tasks are located from Ideate Automation. And finally, probably the most useful window is the help menu. And if anything I say today is confusing, you always can have this little help option to click on and really dig in further. This is just linking to the Ideate software help page. You could also get to this with your browser, and there's a lot of really great step-by-step options here that you can take a look at. So in today's presentation, I'm going to highlight just a reduced set of workflows. The reason I have this reduced set is partially because I think they're really useful workflows, and or I think there's a lot of value that could be added to these server-based projects that are located on a local secure network, right? It kind of fills in the gaps of what we're missing with ACC. Before we get into it though, I just wanted to discuss a few of the standard setups that are going to be the same throughout each one of these tasks. So each one of these tasks is going to ask you to select a model, right? We're trying to save time with how we interact with our Revit model, so we actually have to select the model in the first place, right? So at the beginning of each task, you're always going to be prompted to browse and find your model. So once you click the browse button in the task, it's going to ask you if you want to interact with a live cloud model or a local model. So if you want to interact with a local model, you check that on, and you should see a list of the most recent files that you have opened below. But if you don't see that, you can always click on the Manage button, and this is going to open up your Files screen. And from here, you can just add the files, directly navigate to it on your local secure server. You could also interact with your live cloud models, same process. You'd browse, click on live cloud models. If you don't see your project in your most recent list here, you can always click on the Manage button on the bottom, sign into your account, and get access to all of those cloud models to interact with them. Another through line between each one of these tasks is that you can schedule the tasks. This is kind of the secret sauce, right, of Ideate Automation. Hopefully you can set up a task that can run on a schedule and save you time in your day-to-day. So you could either set it up to run immediately, run at a specific date, run daily, weekly, or monthly. And there's a lot of value in setting up some of these recurring tasks so we don't have to think about them all the time, right? All right, so with that, let's get into our first task of this presentation. So the first part of this presentation, I'm going to go through a lot of these kind of basic tasks, and by the second half, I'm going to talk about how we can edit these tasks even further in a more advanced workflow. But for now, let's talk about a few basic workflows to get warmed up with this tool, right? So the first task that I wanted to cover was opening up a Revit file, which to some might seem a little elementary, but I think there is a lot of value in using this tool, especially if you have a very large model. So even on some of the best managed projects, some file sizes can really get out of hand, especially if you're working on an airport or campus project or infrastructure project. Sometimes the file gets out of hand and it takes, a long time to open up that Revit file every day. And if that is the case, if you are in that scenario, you can set up a task to automatically open up your file at the beginning of your workday. So, imagine you get up, you're working from home, you wake up at 7 a.m., you turn on your computer, and then you go about your day, you make breakfast, drive your kids to school, but by the time you get back to your computer, the file that you're working with is already opened up and it has the correct work set settings to start working with the project immediately and effectively. So I think there's a lot of value in taking advantage of this tool to have a Revit file open up on a daily basis to save you time so you don't have to actively sit in front of your computer and go through this process. So let's just go through the basic setup here. Like with all tasks that we're going to be covering today, we're going to click on the Create button, and here is going to open up the list of template tasks available with Ideate Automation. So this task in particular is going to be located under General, and it's just called Audit Open Revit Files here. So once you click on that task on the right, you can just click on the Next button in the bottom right-hand corner. And the interface is super simple. This is going to be kind of a commonality with a lot of these tasks. And in this particular setup, I would really only recommend, setting up 3 things. First off, as I mentioned, you got to select the Revit file that you want to open. And what's nice here is you could select multiple files here if you want. You could open up multiple files within this task. I would also check out the work sets. So by default, I believe this task has open Revit models with all work sets closed checked on. So the whole point of this scenario that I'm presenting to you is that your model will be opened up in a working file state, right? So we want some of our work sets on, right? So I usually recommend unchecking that. But you also have the option after that to close very specific work sets here. So if you know, for instance, that you're only working on the interior set of work sets, you could uncheck this option, but then list out in this form below any of the work sets that you're not going to interact with, right? And there are a lot of ways that Ideate allows you to phrase these work sets, and all of the phrasing of that to make it more efficient to close. So all of that is available on the Ideate website if you want to get into the specifics of how you can list out the work sets. But essentially, you're just listing out the names of the work sets here. And finally, I'd recommend checking on Audit your file. So because in this scenario we're working with a larger Revit file, it is a good idea to audit these files on a regular basis. Auditing does make the file open a little bit more slowly, but because we're doing an automated task here, it doesn't really matter as much because we're not sitting in front of the computer to open it, right? So I think this is a good idea to do on these larger projects to clear out some minor warnings. So with that, once you have that basic setup, you can just click the next button on the bottom, and you'll be presented with your final screen where you can review all of the task setups, and you could either run it or you could schedule it. So in this scenario, I might recommend scheduling it to open up on a daily basis so that your model is ready to go at the beginning of every workday. With that, let's go on to our next workflow, automated printing. The reason that I wanted to highlight this workflow in particular is not necessarily because it's useful for server projects alone, but I'd say it's an incredibly popular task that lots of different project teams want to take advantage of, regardless of the project type or location. So I think there's a lot of use cases for automating your printing. And a lot of users maybe on this call know that when you hit the print button in Revit, it will immediately, lock up your Revit session. You can't really interact with your file. So, and sometimes when you have a really huge set, it can take, and I hate to say it, up to an hour or more to print out your full set, right? So we don't want to be sitting in front of our computer while this is happening. It would be really great if we could automate this printing process. So imagine if you're in the construction document development phase, you could automate the printing to happen every Friday afternoon, let's say, and by Monday morning, you have a fresh set to review with your team already put in the folder location that you specify. So this task is located under the automation scripts under publishing, and we have the option to export PDF combined. And you might notice that there's also a task just below it called export PDF individual. So I'll let you in on a little secret. They do exactly the same thing, except the combined version of this task automatically has the option to combine your PDF into one document checked on. So essentially this task will automatically make sure that all of the sheets in your set are going to be combined into one PDF. So I usually select that version of it. So with that selected, I'm going to click Next. And here we have our interface, and I wanted to point your attention here to the upper right-hand corner of the screen. This is one of those tasks that has the additional options available. So in most cases, actually I think in all cases, these template tasks will have additional options checked off, and it gives you kind of a simplified version of the screen. But when I see the additional options, I usually want to check it on to just understand what options are available for me to fill in. So in this particular setup, I do have additional options checked on, and what that does is make my sheet and view set and PDF export setups viewable and able to be editable in this interface. But anyway, with that out of the way, let's just go through our steps again. So for this setup, we want to obviously select a Revit file. You could also select multiple Revit files if they have similar print setups. You need to, of course, select a folder that you're going to put these PDF prints to. And finally, you want to look at selecting the view and sheet setup. So this is going to be your set of sheets that are going to be a part of your construction documents. And you also want to select your export settings. So the PDF export settings would refer to kind of the sheet size and then DPI quality and whatnot of your print. So some Revit users might, start to understand the correlation between these final settings, right? So when you're actually in Revit and you're exporting a PDF to print, you have these similar options here. So these settings right here in the task setup directly correspond to the settings that you would put in the general Revit interface. So you can see that the sheet view set corresponds to the selected views/sheets within Revit. So with that concept in mind, I would usually recommend actually going into your Revit project first, setting up your export settings, setting up your views and sheet settings, and having that saved to the project first, and then typing in those exact names into the task setup. So that way you know that you're printing out the exact sheet set that you're interested in, right? So this is, a time when you want to interact with your Revit model first before setting up the task. But with all of that set up, we just have to hit the next button. And this is going to get us to our final screen where we can either run this task immediately or schedule it. So I usually recommend running the task in most cases just to make sure everything's working correctly and make sure that everything's printing out as you would expect it. But once you make sure that everything's set up correctly, you can set this up to be scheduled maybe on a weekly basis, and it's just going to run in the background while your computer is on, and you don't have to think about it much after that. All right. Let's next move on to our next task, saving a file as. So once again, this might be a little bit of an elementary concept, but I think there is a lot of value in applying this workflow to a secure server-based project, because when you're working on a local network, secure or otherwise, you are losing some of the features that you get with BIM 360 or ACC. So one of the key features that I really like about that cloud collaboration tool is that you can publish the model, and publishing a model can really act as a model backup for your project. But in this scenario that I'm, proposing, we don't have that option, right? So we need other options to create backups of our model. So back in the day, we would just manually create progress models, right? By, making a copy of the model at certain time periods. But now we can take advantage of Ideate Automation to create these copies using the save file as command, or task, I should say. So you can find this task under the automation scripts, file maintenance, and file save as RPT. I'm going to select that and click the next button in the bottom right-hand corner. And here there are actually a few settings that I want to go through for this setup. Now, this task isn't just making a copy of your model, it is literally opening up your model and saving as, right? So because of that, it has a lot of settings related to opening up the model and how the model is opened up, right? So that's why we have so many settings in this list here. Just a note here, in this interface, I have additional options checked on in the upper right-hand corner, which is going to reveal all of these options here. So step number one, like in all of our other tasks, we're going to select a Revit file, right? And this could also be multiple Revit files. The next step I would look at is closing your work sets. Because we're making a copy of this project, there's no need for us to have the work sets open. We could always, open them up later if we need to go back to it, but this is just going to allow the process to happen much more quickly. The next thing we want to look at is suppressing Revit messages. This is a really cool feature, actually, that I think other competing automation services don't, correctly utilize. So, some automation services, when they run tasks on the model, will get bound up at the, when they get pop-ups, like let's say, oh, dimension needs to be deleted or so on. This feature lets you just push past that and run your tasks without getting bound up at that step. So very useful. It should be checked on by default, but I just wanted to highlight that in this presentation. I would also recommend checking on auditing and compacting your model. So this is especially useful, again, if you're working with a very large model. This can sometimes clear out small warnings. And because we're making a copy or a progress model, it doesn't really, matter how long this potentially takes, because in normal situations, auditing and compacting the model could take a little bit longer. The next thing we want to look at is detaching from central. So because this is a copy, we don't necessarily need to make like a central model of the file. So I would recommend detaching it with preserved work sets here, so we can always recentralize it later. And we would also, of course, want to pick a save location. So this could be something like an archive folder, progress model folder, backup folder, whatever you call it, just a central location to get those files together. And finally, I would uncheck overwrite the existing file. And this is because we're trying to make progress models. If this was checked on, it would save as over all of these progress models. And I really want to have a history of models to go back to just in case to continue accessing. So with that, there are a few other settings, but for the most part, those are the ones I usually work with. I'll hit the next button and I'll review the final settings here, but I can either run this immediately or schedule it to happen maybe on a weekly basis, let's say. All right. Next workflow I want to cover are COBie data exports. And the reason that I wanted to briefly highlight this workflow is because it's fairly common for federal clients, or even clients that are just in facility management, to require something like COBie, if not COBie itself. I like to call it kind of COBie light for a lot of firms and what they request. But Ideate Automation has a specific database export that will pull together all of the COBie data that you need in that Excel format. So this task template is going to be located under the Ideate software script under COBie. And once you select that, and actually I should mention, this is one of our first tasks that actually requires an Ideate plugin. So the way this task works is it is using Ideate BIM link to pull together that data. And we're going to come back to this plugin a little bit later in the presentation, but this is one of the first tasks that actually requires some of the plugins from Ideate. But anyway, once we select that, we can click the next button. And this is a super simple setup. We just have to select two things here. You have to select your Revit model, and you have to select an export folder here. So we would just browse to it. And with that, I'll hit next. And this will get us to our final screen where we can review our settings and either run it immediately or schedule it. So I like to schedule something like this maybe 2 weeks out from deadline so I can review it and then schedule it again to happen, just before the deadline, right? Make sure things are on track. And this is the final output. Uh, Nothing crazy, but it is, the standard Kobe output formatted correctly. You'll probably at this point want to pick and choose what data that you want to pull for your client, maybe add in a few more things, but this is a really great starting point to get that deliverable to the client. All right. And with that, we're going to talk about, I'd say, the topic of the hour for me, which is model metrics. So model metrics is basically just tracking element counts within your model. And I think it's really valuable to do this for two main reasons. First off, when you track model metrics, it gives you a good handle of the quality of your model, and it can also help you improve performance on the model. Another reason is because, as I previously mentioned, it's becoming more common for clients, especially federal clients, to request the Revit model as the final deliverable. And if that is the case, they probably have some BIM standards that you need to comply to. So having a handle on your model metrics can help you better understand if you're meeting those contractual obligations. So Ideate Automation has a pre-made health check, which is a really great starting point for these model metrics that I'm talking about. So with this pre-made health check, you're going to get an Excel export of a lot of the major counts in your model. And what we see here in this list are kind of the top key categories that can either contribute to model performance. So for instance, we're tracking things like in-place families, model lines, detailed groups, CAD imports. All of these elements in excess can cause performance issues on the model. Not only that, they usually can be included in some BIM compliance language as well, based off of what the client is requesting from you. Next to each one of these counts is also a little cell that is highlighted in red. So these cells will highlight in red if you go in excess of any one of these numbers. So it's a really great way to visually tell the team if we're in excess of any of our targets here. So let's look at the basic setup that is available with a health check. So under the Create section, we're going to go to the Ideate software scripts, and under Health Check, we'll find our template here. And as you select it, you'll probably see on the bottom, the description is going to include a lot of different plugins that are required here. So here we have Ideate Automation required, obviously, Ideate BIM Link, Ideate Explorer, and a few other apps here. So just so you know, this is a task that requires a lot of Revit plugins to function correctly. So with that selected, you can hit the next button. And this is the very basic setup to get things started here. You first want to select the Revit file that you're going to pull these metrics from. You also want to select the Excel template file. So in most cases, this will be selected by default, the correct one, but I wanted to highlight this portion of the form because we're going to come back to this later, but just know that that is available. We also want to select a folder to export the metrics to. And finally, we want to create an export name. So by default, it's going to include the date that it was exported, which I think is really valuable so that you can have a history of your model metrics over time. You could see progress potentially as you clean things up in the model. But depending on your workflow, you might want to cut that out of the title. And in that case, you could save over that Excel document every time the task is run. One little note here at the bottom, we have these options to include annotation issues and views on sheets. So both of these aspects of the model metrics are more focused on construction documentation quality. Now, for me, I'm more interested in model metrics more so than construction documents. Obviously, both are very important, but for the purposes of our setup, I usually have those unchecked, and this will allow the task to run a little bit more quickly. So just a note here. And finally, once you click the next button, you'll just review your settings, and you can either run this immediately or schedule it. And this is the output that you get. So this is a really great starting point to get a snapshot of the model health of your project, and it could help you prioritize what you might need to clean up, what you maybe don't need to focus on as much for model cleanup. So before we move on, I wanted to point out one minor way you could potentially customize this output. So remember, in the previous part of this presentation, I mentioned that each one of these cells right here is highlighted in red when your target number is in excess, right? So in this example, we see that detailed groups should be less than 10. So this is actually controlled by the template, whether the cell is visualized as red or not. So thus far, we've been looking at the summary page of our Excel document, that output, but we also have a lot of other sheets along the bottom of our Excel output, including the pivot metric values. So if you were to edit the pivot metric values in the template file, you could edit these thresholds. So once you click on that tab right there, you can see your list of numbers on the bottom right here. So me as a BIM manager, maybe I have some different priorities here. Maybe I want my CAD imports to be 0, but I don't really care so much about my detailed groups. I'll set that to like 1,000 or something. That's probably a lot of detailed groups, but you get the idea, right? You can kind of prioritize how those cells show up in red and help kind of prioritize efforts with your team and understand your metrics in a different way. So at this point, you might be asking, okay, well, where's my Excel template exactly? Well, remember, I mentioned in the previous step here that we are pointing to a template file here, this Excel template file, Ideate Health Check. So this is an Excel file that is completely editable for the purposes of visualizing our data. So if we go back to the settings of our Ideate automation window, you can see that there's a folder location under program files that shows where all of our sample tasks are held, including that Excel document, right? So we can navigate to that folder location, make those minor edits that I'm talking about. And now every time we run this task and point to this Excel document, it is going to automatically visualize those cells in the way that we want to see them, right? So this is a really quick way to do some minor editing to get a different visual output. But what if we wanted to do even more customization? So this is something that is a really interesting workflow that I think could apply to a handful of different projects. So in the next part of this presentation, I'm going to cover how you can almost fully customize the Excel output from the Ideate Health Check. And the reason I think this could be valuable is if you have a client that has BIM standards, you could potentially translate those BIM standards to metrics that are tracked in your model. And running a health check or a model metrics check on your model can verify if you are meeting the BIM standards of the clients. And it's a really quick way to get a snapshot of your model without picking through it completely. So in the second part of this presentation, I'm going to talk about how to turn this standard template into a more customized template. So here you can already see we're getting a lot more data from our model. So in this new customized template, I have added new metrics. I'm also tracking custom project parameters that are unique to my Revit model. And I'm also visualizing specific warnings that maybe are important to my project. So all of these aspects are controlled by how we create formulas within the Excel document. And the things that I'm listing here on this example are kind of an amalgamation of different contractual requirements that I've seen throughout the years. So this isn't necessarily relating to one client in particular, but I have seen these requirements come up here and there depending on client needs. So before we get into how to fully customize this document, let's talk about the anatomy of this task itself. So the way Ideate Automation has set up this task is it's composed of three main components. It's first composed of the BIM link definitions. These are the link files that actually export data from our project. It then uses an Excel template that pulls together all of that BIM link information and visualizes it in a summary page. And finally, we have a script definition. So the script definition runs all of this for us, and it is also the form interface that shows up when we complete the form on the create page of Ideate Automation. So for our example, I'm going to be primarily focusing on the BIM link definitions and Excel template. And we could potentially do editing to our script definition, but for today's demo, I'm not even going to get into it. So let's first talk about the BIM link definitions. So this task is pointing to a folder that holds a ton of these BIM link definitions. And these directly correspond to the Revit plugin Ideate BIM link. It's running off of that plugin program. And you can see by the name of each one of these files that each one of these files is exporting a different piece of information, right? One of them is exporting dimensions, grids, keynotes, imports, and so on, right? So if we wanted to track more data that is not captured in the default health check, we could make a new BIM link file that captures more data than what is in this list here. The next thing we want to look at is the Excel template. So this Excel template, as we've shown before, is how we're visualizing this data. Not only that, it pulls together all of the BIM link files into one spot for that data visualization. So we understand our key components to totally customize this task output. Now I'd recommend finding the locations of these tasks and then copying them. So the BIM link files would be their own folder set, along with the Excel template and the definition here. So you might have forgotten where these are located. Just as a reminder, all of these tasks are located at the following location. If you click on the settings button, everything's going to be located under the program files. So once you navigate to those set of tasks, you can copy them to this location. So this is the custom scripts location. Ideate Automation has set aside this folder specifically for this type of work when you're customizing your scripts to the next level, right? And you could put it at a different location, but I like putting it here because once we get to the create portion of our steps, it quickly identifies this folder location for us. So that'll make more sense in just a moment here, but in most cases, I'd recommend copying here. All right, so we have our elements copied. Let's actually get into building up our customization here. So here we have our list of BIM link files. And as I mentioned, all of these BIM linked files are created with Ideate BIM link, that Revit plugin. So let's look at how we can actually make some custom BIM link files. So here we're kind of switching gears. We have stepped away a little bit from the Ideate Automation window, and we are now in Revit, and we're under the Ideate software where we have all of our different plugins, but the main one we're going to be working with is BIM link. So in this example, I am going to create a BIM link file specifically for design options, which weren't previously a part of that default health check. So we'll go to BIM link, and I'm going to create a new BIM link. And this is going to be part of a template. So under quality control, Ideate offers all of these templates, including a design option BIM link. So I'm going to click next, and this is going to pull together anything that falls under a design option. So it's tracking all of these categories. I'm going to go to the link tab, and I'm going to rename this HC-design option. And then I can look at these other areas as well, including filters. So this is showing how it's finding the design option elements. And once I've reviewed this, I can click done. And from here, I can actually export this information to see what this data looks like. So this is just going to be an Excel export that I'm saving to my desktop. Once that's done, I can click Open File. And this is the raw export of that BIM link. So you can see that we have a lot of different data here. Now, the task that's going to come up next is actually pulling this data into our Excel document and summarizing it into our summary page. But this is the starting point, right? We have the raw data. Now we just need to incorporate it into our project. The next workflow I wanted to show you is how you can pull out custom data from the model. So let's say your client is interested in asset management, right? And they have a BIM template with custom parameters that need to be filled in for the project compliance and the final deliverable, right? So we can use BIM Link to track how much of our project has been filled in, how many of those parameters have been filled in for quality assurance. So I'm going to go to BIM Link, and I'm going to create a new file. And this is going to be by category and a multi-category BIM link. And I'm going to rename this to HC-custom parameter. I know, very creative name here, but you could name this something more meaningful for your own project. This is just an example. And I'm going to be tracking an instance parameter. I'm going to be clicking next. And right now, this is tracking all of these categories, but I only want to track a few categories. So if we're thinking about asset management, maybe we only want to track maybe mechanical equipment, let's say. So I'm going to search for that and check that on. And let's say I also want to search for electrical equipment, but you could basically filter to any category. All right. So next, I want to go to my properties, and this is going to introduce a screen very similar to how creating a schedule would look. And what we need to do is pull over properties to kind of make our BIM link, but it's going to look a lot like a schedule. So I usually look at the family names or categories here because this will easily identify the asset in my model. And really sky's the limits with any property that you can pull over here, including custom properties that are unique to the project. So in this case, I can pull over my custom parameter here, click add, and that's going to be a custom line item in my BIM link here. So with that, I can just review the rest of my settings here, but otherwise I'll hit done. And now let's export this and see what we get. And once again, this is just going to be an Excel file. And we'll go ahead and open up the file. And this is a pretty short list of data, but imagine you're tracking lots of different assets, right? This would be a much longer list. And maybe the client is interested in tracking certain parameters associated with each one of these assets in the list, right? So this is a way to kind of verify all of that data and get a snapshot of the quality of the parameters being filled in. All right, and with that, we can go and save these link definitions. So from that same screen, all you need to do is right-click on the BIM link and save link definitions. And we are going to save these link definitions to that copied folder that I was speaking about earlier that has those default link definitions. And we're just going to save them all to that folder location. And just to clarify, each one of these BIM link files that are in our folder is directly corresponding to a sheet in our template. So hopefully this is starting to make a little bit more sense here. We are exporting this data and it's getting pulled into the Excel document as a sheet. So once it's pulled into the Excel document, all of that data is accessible in hopefully a summary page that you can create, right? So you could have many, many tabs in this Excel document and just reference and summarize that data in a single screen. All right, with that, let's talk a little bit more about our Excel template. We previously did some minor editing to this Excel template, but let's do a little bit more. Let's start to understand what's happening here. So Here, if you click on the default Excel template and you click on one of the cells that has the summary numbers, you start to get a better understanding of what is happening here. So as you click on the cell, you can see that there's a complicated formula that pulls together the summary number here. So if we look at the anatomy of this a little bit more closely, the first part of this formula is more for formatting purposes. So it's checking if there's a project name. So essentially it's checking if the template has run correctly. And in the second part, it is going to HC ideate sheet, the name of the sheet. It's going to column N in that sheet, and then it's counting up all of the true values. So we're basically using some advanced formulas to summarize data in other sheets, and we're pulling this all together on a single page. So I'm not going to claim to be an Excel wizard here. I essentially just copied and pasted these default template setups and then made minor adjustments to get the exact results I wanted. And just to clarify, to make any of these summary pages work correctly, you just need the second half of this formula right here. So this is the actual formula that counts and summarizes the data. So let's use our design options as an example here of how we can start to customize our own data and visualize our own data. At this point, I'm assuming you've exported all the data you want to see from your BIM link files. Now we can actually take a moment to figure out how we want to visualize that data. So in this example, I basically copied that previous cell formula and I formatted this so that the formula would go to my design option sheets, go to column B, and then summarize all of the unique names in that column. So after doing all of that, we get a final number of 19 design options. So this is just a simple way to kind of pull together these numbers here. So once you put together this template file, these numbers are going to automatically update no matter what Revit model that you run this on because of the way the formula is set up. It's going to always point to the correct sheet, always going to point to the correct column. So this is the basic setup that I did for every single cell that you see that it's unique in that final template. So once we save that final template, we actually can run our script. So at this point, what we've done is we've copied the template information, the BIM link files, the Excel files, and the definition files. We then created more BIM link files for those data exports. And we have edited our Excel document to better visualize that data in our sheet. And the last thing we need to do is actually set up our task. So here under the create window, we're back where it all started. And at the very bottom, you can see our custom scripts in that final list here, right? So that's why I recommended copying to that location. It's going to automatically show up in the bottom right there. So with that, we can select our definition file. And because this is an exact copy of our health check, the interface should be exactly the same as the health check. We didn't do any editing to that. So with that, I'll select it, hit next. And with this setup, I'm going to check on additional options here. So once I check on additional options, we obviously have many more options to look at, right? But the primary difference between our previous setup is that this time we're going to point to our specific Excel document location. So that Excel document that we did our custom formula editing on, we will just click browse and navigate to that location, point to it. And we will also update the link library path. So that set of ideate BIM links will just point to that folder location that holds all of those .link files. But with that, otherwise, the setup is basically the same. You can just set up everything else as you normally would and click next and get to your final screen. And you can either run this immediately or you can set this to run on a schedule. And I really like running this on a schedule because it gives me a snapshot and progress over time of the model metrics. And you can really set this model tracking on autopilot to get a better understanding of your model without even opening it up. So just a final word on some of these workflows that I showed you here today. I obviously showed you a very manicured, cleaned up version of how this actually works. But in real life, when you are setting up these custom tasks, it's actually a process of going back and forth, running the task, doing a little bit of editing to your Excel document, running it again, making sure things are working right, maybe exporting another BIM link file, right, to get the exact output that you want. But once you set all of that up, it is a little bit of a setup, but once you set it up, you can run this on pretty much any Revit model. So this could be valuable for a few different reasons. Maybe your firm wants to implement better model quality checks, and you could set this up on one model and then run these checks along all of your models in your own firm to make sure that you have really great quality assurance. And this could also be really helpful if you have maybe a recurring client with BIM standards, right? And if they have a list of BIM standards, you could set up a custom model metric to specifically verify their needs on the project. So with that, I hope I've covered some interesting tasks here today that you can use in your own workflow, but I'll wrap it there and open it up for questions that are in the chat.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Olivia. Yeah, if you guys have any additional questions, you can throw them in the Q&A there. Naveen, are there any questions that you want to highlight that were asked in the Q&A during this session?
Yeah, of course. Actually, I have a few. Someone asked that their audit on file open, they couldn't see it on their end. We've added that feature in a latest release. So we recommend you to update to version 3.3 to be able to see that. Another question was about publishing to ACC. They asked if we can confirm you can publish more than once a week on a schedule. That's absolutely correct. You can set up a schedule with and without link as well. Everyone on the team can set that up. And it also offers a centralized location where you can set up your publishing to be occurring regardless of where it's hosted or what Revit version. So that was a great question to be asked. Another question was on supporting Revit server projects. So in order for you to do that, you'd actually have to open the model once through the UI. It will populate it in your recent Revit files. Then you'll be able to run the task when that list is populated on that file. Lastly, and I can see a few more questions actually coming in, mostly related to downloading. Lastly, I just want to really give a big thanks to Olivia for this excellent presentation and sharing with us how she's been using, Ideate Automation and showing us how she's customized the health check reporting and the script to suit her need. The goal of that template was to serve as a starting point for you to personalize and track the data that matters to you. So I really was so happy to see how you've been using it and sharing that with us. So big thanks to you.
Oh, thank you so much. No, very happy to be presenting with you all again, and yeah, glad to, talk about some of this work.
Excellent, thank you. If anyone has any more questions, feel free to reach out to us, IDA Software Support at idasoftware.com. We're more than happy to continue assisting you if you have any further questions that you couldn't answer them during this webinar. And thank you so much for your time.